I study the patterns of the universe.
Advancement in the brain.
Virtual your mind. Talking about your life, fundamental principles,
philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Welcome to the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez. I'm also the founder of the Think Grow Prosper brand and thinkgrowprosper.com. And it's my job on this show to explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, creators, entrepreneurs, artists, and all sorts of interesting people to bring you different perspectives you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. Today, I wanted to do a solo episode and just talk to you one-on-one about a subject that is very important to me and something that's captured my attention for a long time. It's actually a meta skill, meaning that it affects many other skills. And it's the topic of learning and retaining information that you read or listen to or are exposed to in some way. I'll describe a scenario and you tell me if this sounds familiar. You read a book, you highlight every other paragraph. It's life-changing. You can't believe you've gone this long without reading this book. And then when it comes time to talk about what you've learned, maybe it comes up in conversation with a friend, or you're trying to support an argument of yours, you can't recall the main points. There's maybe some nuanced ideas that you can't quite articulate. This is frustrating. This is something that has bothered me for some time to varying degrees over the years. And so I set out to really just learn the basic principles of learning so that I could make sure that what I was reading was actually sticking with me. Because really, what's the point of reading all these books and learning all of these things if they're not going to stick with you, if they're not going to actually be integrated into your life in a way that's useful? And so that's what I want to talk about today, is the principles of effective learning. It's very easy in today's world to have what some people call the illusion of competence. We have so much information being shot at us all the time, and we have Google right at our fingertips, right? So we have this feeling that we know things, but that's just being familiar with something. It's recognition. It's not actual knowledge. We don't actually know it deep inside of us, and this is what is referred to as the illusion of competence. So that's what I want to address here. Okay, first I want to talk about what are the reasons that we don't retain information. What are the reasons that we don't really learn effectively? And as far as I can tell, there are 4. The first is that we get bogged down in the details, and we get kind of confused by the details. The second is that we don't spend enough time with the information, and we don't learn in a way that is effective. Our study sessions aren't challenging enough. The third is that we don't use what we learn. We don't apply it to our life. And the fourth is that what we're learning is not relevant enough to our lives. We don't have a good enough reason for learning what we're learning. So given these 4 causes, I want to offer 4 different principles that address these causes of ineffective learning. And the principles I've given them short little names. The first is structure. The second is effort. The third is active learning. And the fourth is reason. So I'm going to unpack each of these with you here and explain them in detail, and also give you some strategies that you can hopefully apply to your life and learn better. Okay, the first principle is structure. Structure has to do with how information is organized. And organization matters because understanding how information is laid out helps you get a feel for what the main ideas are and just helps you have a better grasp of the information. And it gives you kind of a scaffolding on which you can organize new information related to that particular topic. And for example, this is why table of contents exist, and actually why I really recommend reading and studying the table of contents of a book before diving into it, because you'll be able to grasp the main ideas before you dive right into the book. This is important because you can think of it kind of like a map. Maps are useful because they give us the lay of the land without getting lost in the details. So it helps orient ourselves, right? Like if you're at street level and you're lost somewhere, it's very difficult to understand where you are, especially if you're in a completely new place, if you don't have a map. And so table of contents kind of give you this map. There are different ways information can be structured, and it's not always explicitly stated. In fact, often it's not, especially if you're just reading like an article or something. Often the structure isn't explicitly stated. You just kind of have to figure it out for yourself. But some of the ways that information can be structured include by location. This is useful for subjects that lend themselves to being organized by location. Geography comes to mind. They can also be organized alphabetically. They can be organized hierarchically by category. If you're studying, let's say, a medical text and you need to learn all the diseases of the brain, like there's probably categories that you could divide each of them into, right? Based on maybe what part of the brain they originate in or whatever. So figure out a structure and define it so that you can have a better grasp of the material. And this is actually why I love also listening to TED Talks and interviews with authors before I read their book. Because in an interview or like a short lecture, what an author has to do is distill and condense the main ideas of their book down to like a 20-minute talk or something. And that is very, very useful because then you know the main points. And it's very useful to identify the main ideas. So that's essentially what structure does. It helps you identify the main ideas of a particular topic. And actually, this is also why I love learning platforms like Skillshare, because the classes are organized into mini lessons and each one contains the main idea. And you can see how each class is laid out before you even start the class. And this makes it super easy to see all of the main points that are covered in a particular class. And having this framework helps you absorb the information in the class more effectively. At least that's what it does for me. As many of you know, I've actually been working on a book on and off for the past couple years. And as such, I thought it would be a good idea to take a writing class or two to brush up on my writing skills. And I did that through Skillshare, and I've actually been blown away by the quality of classes that Skillshare has to offer. And it's super easy to use. You just pick a topic, anything from social media marketing to cooking to photography, whatever it is. They have over 20,000 classes, so really anything you can think of. And then you browse the classes, you pick a teacher, it's all done via video, and it's all self-paced, which I love. And I'm super proud to have Skillshare as a sponsor of this podcast. In fact, they are extending a special offer to listeners of the Think Grow podcast. Go to Skillshare.com/TGP and get 2 months of Skillshare for just 99 cents. You heard that right. That was not a mistake. You can get 2 months of unlimited access to over 20,000 classes for just 99 cents. So go to Skillshare.com/TGP to sign up and join the millions of other students who are already learning. Again, that's Skillshare.com/TGP. Excellent way to start learning new information. Okay, so principle number 2, effort. This has to do with how you study and how you interact with information. You want to make your study sessions, your learning sessions, challenging and interactive. So you do this by engaging with the information. I had Jim Quick on the podcast. He's a memory and learning expert and celebrity brain coach. And he says that often when we have trouble learning, it's not a problem of retention, it's a problem of attention. So pay attention to what you're learning. One way to do this is to take notes. Like, write down what it is that you're learning. You could kind of journal about the topic. So here are some prompts, some questions that you can use to structure your notes. How does this information fit in with your life? What are your general feelings or thoughts about this information? Why do you agree or disagree with this information? And then the last one, and probably the most important, is how does this information relate to what you already know? And this is very important because in order for information to stick, you really have to relate it to what it is that you know. And to do this, you really have to engage with it. Okay, the next strategy here is to practice remembering. And this is really at the heart of learning. And if there's one thing that you could take away from this episode, it would be this step right here. Practice remembering. What do I mean by practice remembering? Okay, here's how most of us interact with information. We read a book, we think the ideas are interesting, we listen to a talk, we find it inspiring, and then we just move on with our lives. And we kind of forget about it. That's an ineffective way to learn, and the reason is because you don't savor the ideas. Learning happens when you are able to recall the information. That's how you know that it's truly, you grasp it and it's actually absorbed into your subconscious and it's sunk in. And the way to do that is to practice it. How do you practice it? Well, here's one way. When you're reading a book, instead of just finding something interesting and moving on, what you want to do is when you come across something that you find interesting or worth noting, set the book aside, pause the lecture or video, whatever you're listening to, and then see if you can recall what it was that was being said in your own words. You can think of this kind of like giving yourself a pop quiz. And the thing about this is that it's not sexy and it's actually not intuitive and it's not fun really because it's difficult. But that difficulty is actually the key to comprehension. And this has actually been shown in various studies. Okay, so now if you want to take this to the next level, take this strategy to the next level, you would implement the Feynman technique, named after the famed physicist Richard Feynman. And this is kind of just a modification of what I just said. All it is identifying the specific information or topic you want to remember and then write it down, explain it in writing as if you were explaining to someone else, without looking at the source material. And if you get hung up, go back to the source material and then continue writing. But do it until you can explain the subject matter without looking at the source material, right? And once you've mastered that and you can explain something in writing without looking at the original source, then simplify that language so that a 6-year-old would understand it. It's been said that if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. That's often attributed to Einstein. Who knows if he actually said that, but the sentiment is true. Being able to explain something and distilling it down is a very effective way to learn. Now, to take this even one step further and really solidify the ideas that you've consumed, you want to implement what's called spaced repetition. And all this is essentially recalling information at regular intervals. So doing the very thing that I just described, the Feynman technique, the practice remembering, putting things into your own words, recalling information without looking at the original source material, doing these things at regular intervals. And the reason this is important is because it's been shown that, when you first encounter new information, it's fresh in your mind, but that memory will degrade as time goes on. And it will do so until it actually disappears, unless you recall that information before it disappears. So by recalling that information, what you're doing is strengthening the connection that made that recall possible. There are actually apps that kind of automate this process for you. I personally just kind of wing it, and that may or may not be the most effective way to do it, but I really like just revisiting information and trying to recall it as I see fit, maybe a few days to a week after I initially consume the information. The reason this process is important is because it gives your working memory a chance to transfer ideas and information from your working memory to your long-term memory. And your long-term memory is really where, the bulk of your intelligence lies and the bulk of your knowledge lies. But the problem is that many of us don't engage with information long enough. We don't let information sit with us long enough for that to happen. But see, the thing about working memory is that it only has about 2 to 4 slots, so to speak, where it can hold information until it transfers to long-term memory. It's kind of like a holding cell. You want to keep information in that holding cell long enough for it to be transferred to long-term memory for later recall. Okay, so that was effort. Now let's talk about the third principle, active learning. What does active learning mean? Active learning is just using what you've learned, applying it to your life, making use of it. So one way to do this is by teaching someone else what you've learned. Learn to teach. And you don't have to do this formally. You can do it very informally when you are talking with your significant other at the end of the day. That's how I do it, actually. I'll be reading during the day, and then at the end of the day, I'll often tell my wife Vanessa what it is that I was learning about. And often she doesn't have any context for what it is that I've learned. And that's really useful because in order to explain something to somebody else and have them grasp it, you really have to know it yourself. And so it's really testing yourself. It's another form of testing yourself, but it's kind of an active way to do that. Talking to someone else, explaining it to someone else is really useful. The other strategy you can use to implement this principle of active learning is to actually apply what you've learned to your life. Use it. Like, make the material concrete. Your brain tends to remember concrete ideas much more than it does abstract ideas. And the way you make something concrete is by using the information and making it real. The sooner you use it, the better. And it really is kind of like a use it or lose it situation. And this brings us to the fourth principle, which is have a good reason for learning. You're not going to apply information to your life if you don't have a good reason for doing it. And so having a good reason means that you're consuming information that is relevant to your life. You're not consuming information just to consume it. This is something that I've actually struggled with because I'm very curious by nature, and I always want to be looking for new and novel information. And to a degree, that's cool. That's fine. But it can get overwhelming if you're really intent on learning a particular thing and you really want it to stick. Make sure it's relevant to your life. This may seem obvious, but I have a feeling that there are a lot of you who are like me in that you might read just to read and you might learn just to learn. And while that's cool, know that it doesn't promote learning as well. The rule here is basically only read it if you need it. From an evolutionary perspective, our memories evolved in order to store information that was related to our survival, right? So things like locations of food sources and complicated social dynamics, things like that. And so these were things that are very important to us. So important that our life depended on it. Obviously, today, you don't need to necessarily remember the location of, berries in your backyard because we have grocery stores and things like that. Although I am a wild food forager. I don't know if you knew this about me. So that's kind of a hobby of mine. And it actually is a very good cognitive exercise. But we'll leave that for another date. Really, the point here is that you want to read and learn in order to solve problems. That's how you know you're reading something that is relevant to your life and that it's going to stick. If you have a particular problem, a specific problem that you're trying to solve or challenge you're trying to overcome, and you seek out information related to that information is going to stick much more than if you're just learning to learn. And, I experienced this years ago, back in my early 20s when I was struggling with acne. I had really bad skin. And, I came across a community of people who were using diet to solve their skin problems. And that really appealed to me because I've always been one for more natural methods and things like that. I tried some medications and it just didn't work out. So I kind of went down that path, and what that looked like was basically just me studying health and nutrition and diet through the lens of solving my problem of getting clear skin. And that was very effective. Everything that I learned stuck with me because I had a problem that I was solving. And now, over a decade later, I still remember the bulk of that knowledge because it was tied to a very pressing problem for me. And by the way, I did solve my problem. It worked. That was many years ago, but the information is still useful to me and relevant to my life. So seek information that is important to you and that solves a problem and that is relevant to your life. And then the other part to this is seek information that interests you. This is the other key. Make sure that what you're reading and learning and listening to is interesting. Skip the boring parts of books. This was very liberating for me once I realized that I could actually do this. I used to buy a book and then think that I had to read it linearly from the beginning to the end. And it was just kind of a, compulsion of mine. But it took me a long time. In fact, it's only been recently where I've given myself the freedom to say, okay, look, I can read the parts of the book that really interest me. And in fact, I retain much more when I do that. The reason is because when you are reading things and learning things that are interesting to you, this increases dopamine production in your brain. And dopamine is associated with interest. And so this creates a very fertile learning environment in your brain and kind of brings emotion into the picture. And when you're able to tie emotion to information, that really helps form long-term memories. So read what interests you. I know that this isn't always possible, especially for people who are students or who, just are obligated to study some information or are assigned information in some way. But if that's your scenario, then what you want to do is focus on the parts of the information that are relevant to you. You can also just make it interesting in some way by tying what you're learning to things that do interest you. And you can always find connections if you look hard enough. And that actually concludes the 4 principles. Again, the 4 principles are structure, effort, active learning, and reason, or have a reason for learning. And here's a little surprise for you. You can remember these 4 principles using a clever little mnemonic device that I devised, which is SEAR, S-E-A-R, structure, effort, active learning, reason. These principles will help sear information into your memory. So, I hope that was useful to you. Let me know what you think. I hope this gave you some useful strategies for learning. Again, please let me know what you think. Leave me a comment on my Instagram at ThinkGrowProsper, on the blog at thinkgrowprosper.com, or wherever you damn well please. All right. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll talk to you later.